Okay, we're going to get to chapter 7 and 8, narrowing differences, and then also wrapping up and bringing the negotiation to a conclusion. And then, as you know from the syllabus, the last few chapters we're going to look at are other items and sort of other matters, really, that you might want to think about while you're negotiating. And those we will wrap up pretty quickly. And in fact, I'm thinking about once we finish this unit, I may condense units 6 and 7 into just one unit, and just because I don't think the material, now that I've looked at it, I'm not sure that material really necessitated 2 units. So it's first time rolling out this online negotiations course, and so these were the kind of bumps that I've sort of expected to have. And it's also the reason why I wasn't too worried about the timing. It was pretty clear that we have more than enough time to finish. So I'll let you know very shortly whether I intend to do that. By the way, a second administrative announcement, just very quickly. There isn't going to be a final exam in this class. I don't know why I put that on the syllabus, so you don't have to worry about that unless there's an outcry from you as the students that you absolutely have to have a final exam and you want one and you're desperate for one. Then I'm not going to do it. I intended all along for the quizzes to serve as the final exam, and I realized that I've listed a final exam as part of the course. There's no reason for us to do that. Normally when I do this course, when I've done this course in the past live, typically the negotiations have served as plenty of work such that final exam was really overkill. So hopefully that's good news for you. All right, let's get to 7 and 8. Let's get to the narrowing of differences and the wrapping up, chapter 7 and 8, and we'll get through that. Competitive narrowing of differences. What are some things that you can do? Well, you can argue. And I'm not talking about the yelling kind. I'm talking about the rational reason discussion that explains why somebody ought to narrow the differences. Oftentimes this may involve legal argument, particularly, obviously, we're talking about legal negotiations. There may be questions of case law that impacts the circumstance. Just recently I was involved in negotiating a settlement of a personal injury matter, and the claims examiner was from a different state than the plaintiff, and the claims examiner didn't really understand the nature of how the law worked in one state, and we had to get a copy of the policy and explain to the claims examiner why her understanding of the policy didn't apply the way she was trying to say it applied in the state of Kentucky, where I'm at right now. And in fact, once we'd gone through that and sort of laid out our rationales to why her understanding was incorrect in Kentucky and why what she was suggesting wasn't going to work and why it wasn't the right understanding, interestingly enough, she relented and offered a fair amount for the case at hand, and the case got settled. So there's an instance where argument, not the yelling, screaming kind, obviously, but just the rational discussion, got her to come around and make the appropriate offer under the circumstances, and the case was resolved. And it resolved, quite frankly, early on. I mean, it was early on in the negotiations, and early on in the case was ripe for settlement, and it got taken care of. So that's what argument it means. Competitive tactics, time limit demands, things like that. If you've negotiated for a while and nothing's working, then sometimes competitive tactics might be useful because maybe the other side needs a wake-up call. The problem is normally by the time you've done a great deal of negotiating, competitive tactics probably aren't the best solution, just because you've already invested a lot of time and energy in the negotiation, and hopefully you have gotten somewhere before you finally try to narrow things down. That said, sometimes you don't have any choice. The other side, as I said, needs a wake-up call, and you have to kind of, smack them on the head and say, hey, listen, what are you doing? So what are some things you can do? Well, you can break off the negotiations. You can just say, look, I've had enough. We're done. We're done talking to you. We'll call us when you're ready to talk reasonably. We're finished. And you just end it. You just say, forget it. We're done. Over. Okay. And you come back to me when you're ready. That's a competitive tactic. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the person's just pushing you to see how far you'll go. And when they realize that you'll go to that length, they kind of come back and say, well, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. What else can you do? Well, you can get angry. I don't recommend anger. That's a very high risk maneuver, and it's very low yield, generally speaking, and it's not professional. I mean, unless you really have a right to be angry at someone for something, and you absolutely need to be this needs to be very righteous indignation and true righteous indignation before you are allowed to get angry. Otherwise, it's just a very bad idea. High risk, very low yield. So I don't recommend that as a tactic. If you're going to make a threat, which is what you're doing by using some sort of competitive narrowing objective, it better be credible. If you say, look, we're going to file suit, and if we file suit, guess what? We're going to ask for attorney's fees and treble damages. Well, if it's an ordinary run-of-the-mill personal injury case, for instance, there are no treble damages. There are no attorney's fees. I mean, in most states anyway. And that would be an illegitimate threat and not credible, and consequently the other side would just ignore it. So it has to be credible in order to have meaning if you're going to use that kind of threat. And that's essentially what we're talking about here with competitive narrowing tactics, or essentially threats. I'm going to give you a time limit. Time limits are okay, but you better stick with it, because if you don't, then the next time you make a time limit demand with the same party, they're going to know he never sticks to his time limits. You can limit your concessions. You can try limiting your concessions. Well, I've already said this is my position, but I can give you a little bit more, or I can take away a little bit less, whichever position you're in. Again, that's a difficult kind of thing to do, but it's part of what you can try to do. Here's what I would say, though, in making concessions. You always should concede something if it's in your client's best interest, and so you have to kind of keep that in mind. If it makes sense for your client, go ahead and concede. Now, what you might want to do is sort of surround the concession with all kinds of wording that lets the other side know, look, I'm not doing this because you're getting the best of me. I'm doing this because my client just doesn't care. My client's fine with this concession. In fact, it works out for the best if my client does this. I mean, and you're going to have to use that kind of wording or similar wording to get the other side to understand this isn't just a caving in. And that's important. Again, we're talking competitive narrowing tactics here. That's important because if you just give in, then they're just going to assume you're just giving in out of weakness. And most of you, especially those of you who are law students and not master's students, I mean, you're aggressive. You're an aggressive species. That's what lawyers are. And if you smell blood in the water, you're not going to ease up a lot of times. So know that of your competitor as well. One of the other things that you can do, and I guess I've already suggested this, is as you're making concessions, just make sure you're explaining it and giving a good reason. One thing that I would remind you of, do not get caught up in the idea that somehow consecutive concessions are some kind of awful demon of negotiating. That's not true. I ran against this all the time with my claims examiners when I would suggest that they make another concession in a negotiation. They would say, well, it's not my turn. Oh, come on. Let's be grown-ups. It's not a question of turns. It's a question of whether it makes sense. And if you're representing a client, whether it's reasonable for you to do so and it benefits your client. It's not a question of turns, and don't treat it that way. It's okay to make consecutive concessions if all the circumstances point you in that direction and it's going to get the matter resolved effectively and appropriately. So don't be afraid to do that. Now, do I recommend you do that all the time? No, of course not, because there is, at some level, there's an understanding that negotiating means that people kind of go back and forth. And so, I don't recommend you do it all the time, but you certainly will make consecutive concessions when necessary and when appropriate. Cooperative tactics. most of the time by cooperation, it's more a matter of cooperating in spirit and not necessarily cooperating in substance. So you will say things like, well, the other side makes a point. You say, that's a really good point. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. Or you can say, gosh, let me mull that over. Well, when you say things like that, you're implying to the other side they've said something important or valuable or meaningful, but you've given up nothing. And so in that sense, it has a patina of cooperation, but gives you a chance to sort of wrap your arms around what's going on, and it gives you some time, and it allows you to appear cooperative without ever really doing anything. You can make promises, and basically that's sort of the idea that I'll act this way that's beneficial to you if you act this way that's beneficial to me. And that's very normal negotiating action. People do that regardless of whether they've studied this course or not. That's just sort of a normal thing that people will do. It's sort of the old you scratch my back, I scratch your back kind of idea. And so that happens all the time. Take breaks. One of the things that I think is probably one of the most useful things I've done, especially when I did an awful lot of mediations. And mediations, one of the reasons mediations do work very well is because the parties are separated, and so consequently it's almost like they're always taking a break from each other. That really can be very valuable. If you're in a face-to-face negotiation, or if you're on a phone call, then sometimes it's a good idea to say, hey, look, let's take a break. Let's put this aside for now. Let's kind of, maybe it gets a little heated or something, and you just really everybody needs to calm down and chill out and just sort of regroup. And so it's always appropriate to say, let's just take a break. I really need a break. I need to go get a soft drink or a glass of water, or whatever it is you do, or just need some air, or whatever. Anything that you can do sometimes to put an end, particularly to a difficult situation, may be helpful, because then it gives everyone a chance to kind of regroup. And oftentimes in the heat of the moment, people will say things or do things that, and this just from human experience, they don't really mean it that way, or they say something that's taken the wrong way, and it just kind of starts to roll out of control. Or maybe you just need a break for a tactical reason. The other side is getting close to something you don't want them to touch. And so you say, you know what, let's just take a short break here for a minute. I need to converse with my client about something, or I need to make a phone call to my client, or I need to just take a break myself. And then that gives you a chance to then examine what's going on and find ways to figure out, how do I push them away from this object. What about closing the deal? And these are, we talked about narrowing and now closing. And these are, really, there's not a whole lot of difference between the narrowing tactics and closing tactics. One thing I will say that is a little bit different oftentimes is that with closing tactics, oftentimes you have outside pressures. You have a trial coming up, for instance. We need to get this done because my client's going to spend $5,000 on this trial, starting tomorrow or starting next week. And if we spend that money, we're just going to go to trial. I can't tell you how many times I heard that from plaintiffs' attorneys who told me, look, if I spend money on this doctor's deposition, then we're done. We're going to trial. My experience was that was rarely the case, and so I never really took that to mean anything. And quite candidly, after several years of experiencing those kinds of attempts, those kind of competitive attempts to close deals, what I started telling most of the plaintiffs' attorneys was, look, I'm not concerned about whether you spend money or not. That's your problem, not mine. I don't mean to be rude about it, but it's your issue. You chose to pursue the case. You chose to file it. Your client has chosen to maneuver the case the way your client has chosen to maneuver it. Your client's in this position because of the circumstances that have gotten us to this point. And so your client has some, your client gets to suffer some of the consequences of the case getting to this point. It's not all on me, it's not all on my client, and therefore I can't take that into account. And so I would just sort of very calmly and rationally and dispassionately just tell them, basically, I don't care. And typically what I found was the vast majority of the time that threat really didn't mean anything, and it was very unusual for the attorney to then just go forward and not settle the case. Sometimes you'll have contractual deadlines, and those contractual deadlines are important, and they may help get something resolved. If you're saying, look, our deal depends on this other deal, and if our deal doesn't get done, the other deal doesn't get done, and I need the other deal in order to make this deal work out. So if you're not going to go forward, then we're done, so I can pursue something else to maintain my rights to this other deal, for instance. What do you do in order to make final concessions? How do you do that? Well, you should never make any concession just to get the deal done. I mean, in other words, if you're simply doing it just for the sole purpose of let's just wrap this up, that's probably not the best thing. What concessions do you make? You make a concession that is going to be the most beneficial to your side of the negotiation. And if you can do that and you can make a concession in good faith, it's going to help your client, then you do it. And if that wraps it up, hallelujah to everyone. How do you know? And this is one of those things that often you have to wonder. When somebody says, well, this is my final offer, how do you know it's their final offer? Well, A, they said so. But does that really mean final offer? I mean, it's like negotiating with my 16-year-old. He assumes nothing is my final offer. I mean, he always assumes everything is open to negotiation. And so he will make a good negotiator, I suppose, at some point in the future. But he likes to try to negotiate everything. And when I tell him, well, that's my final offer, oftentimes he'll say, well, what about this? What about this? No. I mean, typically what I tell him is, no, this is my final offer. You either take it or leave it. Inevitably, of course, he takes what Dad offers because he doesn't have a whole lot of bargaining strength. So he's kind of stuck. But that's not normally the case. Normally, you're not negotiating with your teenager. You're negotiating with other people who do have some bargaining strength, typically, and oftentimes their bargaining strength is very similar to yours in many instances. What do you do when they say, well, it's my final offer? Well, A, do you know the other negotiator, and do you know that they typically say that's my final offer and don't really mean it? If that's the case, then you know it's not really their final offer. They're just saying that. So prior experience. B, you may know it's their final offer if they've given you a very good reason. Look, this is my final offer because I'm under enormous pressure from my client, and I've already conceded some things that I really didn't want to concede, but I chose to try to get the deal done, and really convince my client to concede those issues. And I'm at the point now where I simply have nothing left to concede. I can't give you anything else. I've got to have this deal in this structure in this way. It could be that you're negotiating some, it could apply to anything. You could be negotiating some kind of commercial contract, and one of the old scenarios that I used in the past that was given to me by another professor was the scenario of an opera singer who was negotiating a contract to do a stage production, and there were all kinds of issues involving that, but maybe you get to the point if you represent the opera singer and you say, look, she's conceded, that she's on the downside, that her career is, she's gotten older, and we know you always want the younger singers, but, she's conceded considerably, and then she's taking an ego hit here by conceding the thing she's already conceded, and that's a big deal with opera singers, and therefore, we're not going to concede anything else. You've got to, she's got to have 6 weeks, of running, and you've got to pay her for 6 weeks, whether the opera lasts 6 weeks or not, because it would be embarrassing to her, and it would just be an absolute devastating humiliation to her to get paid for anything less than 6 weeks. And so we can't take less than 6 weeks. Okay, there's an example of something where you say that's it. We have to have the 6 weeks, and at this price that we've already discussed. Does it make sense from the history of the negotiation itself that the final offer is in fact a final offer? In other words, just based on what you've already done going back and forth, does it appear to be legitimate? I mean, does it look like it's in a range of rationality and reasonableness and what you would expect based on the discussions you've already had? So think about that. One other thing, and that I want you to keep in mind, sometimes negotiations do get deadlocked. People just can't come to a resolution. Don't assume that that means that the negotiations are dead. They may be deadlocked, but they may not be dead. And the reason I say that is because I've experienced that on numerous occasions where it appeared that we got to a point where negotiations stalled and just seemed to be going nowhere, and everybody was just sort of treading water. And inevitably, something came up, and I can remember one of the earliest negotiations I had when I started practicing insurance defense law was with this attorney. We'd been back and forth, and he wanted a really what I thought was an extraordinary sum of money. And I don't remember what I told him or what the deal was, but I want to say it was like $10,000 to settle this case, and it was a case where he had wanted $50,000 or something. I mean, we were very far apart, and he was really hammering on me and just hard about no, and here's all the reasons, and I was saying no, here's my reasons, and I just can't move anymore, and he would say, well, I can't move anymore, and we're gonna have to go to trial, and one day I got a phone guy pick up a phone. Hey Gus, you still got that $10,000 on that case? And I'm like, yeah, that was our offer. That was our last offer. In fact, that was the last offer we were ever going to make. He said, well, okay, send me a check. I don't know what happened. Maybe his client, she needed some money quick and she just wanted to get it over with. Maybe she changed her mind. Maybe she had lied to her attorney and he kind of realized, any number of things could happen. I never asked the lawyer what happened. It would have been inappropriate probably for him to tell me anyway. But I got to know him. That was early on, and then over the years I got to know him very well and realized that he was the kind of guy who whatever his rationale, he did it because his client really wanted him to, and it was in his client's best interest. So don't think that a deadlock negotiation will never get reopened, because they often do. What about problem-solving closure tactics? Often there's a reference here to fairness in terms of problem-solving. And let's talk about that as a concept. For our purposes, fairness probably means what is rational, because fairness is kind of a vague sort of idea, and it depends on who's using the term oftentimes as to what fair means. Be careful about using fairness as a criterion for judging the results or judging the outcome or attempting to utilize fairness as a closure tactic, and that is appeals to fairness and that sort of thing. I don't recommend you use appeals to fairness at all, personally, because I found it to just be one of those things that's just not very effective. It's a term that it's slippery, and it's hard to get your arms around it a lot of times, and it just means different things to different people at different times under different circumstances, and I just think that that's not a very good way to try to get a negotiation resolved, and so I don't recommend it. It's conceivable it might work, but I think overall it's not. Argument should meet the needs of each party and preferably make each party better off. One of the best things you can do in terms of problem solving is come to the table with a idea to close the deal that makes everyone better off, and explain why. And so to give the other side, like, look, you know what, your client is going to be better off because of these 3 reasons. Let's say you're negotiating a contract to buy, I don't know, some product for a company that's buying some product that it's going to then put into its own product and make another product. So they're going to use some raw materials in effect, and you're hung up on the time, and the seller wants to have a 5-year contract, but your purchaser who you represent only wants a 3-year deal. Obviously 4 years sounds like an awfully good way to solve that problem, right? But maybe in getting them to come around to 3 years, you explain that one of the good things about you doing 3 years is, what if you run into problems with your suppliers? And what if down the line your suppliers jack you around, and suddenly you are stuck with a 5-year deal where you've got to supply us at price X, and it's lower than the price you really need to charge. If you do a 3-year deal, you have more flexibility, and you would be able to then renegotiate, and if you needed to charge more because your prices had gone up, you're better off. So don't just think of it as the price we're paying, but also think about what you're going to be dealing with in the upcoming time. And none of us can predict what will happen in the future, and so we're trying to let's manage the risk together. Okay, so something like that would be a way to try to problem solve and kind of close a deal. One of the last things I will say about problem solving is you can try just trial and error. Hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? And then you might even brainstorm with the other side. How can we get this done? I mean, what are some avenues of relief? Are there things we can do? In the personal injury game, whether you're on the plaintiff side or the defense side, usually you're just talking about dollars and cents, and so it's a little harder to do problem solving because basically it's just about the money. But nonetheless, there were times when I was able to say, well, maybe we can structure part of the deal, especially if it was a lot of money. And, I'd be able to say, well, look, we can offer you, some way to structure some of this money so that your client doesn't get, 150 grand in their pocket immediately, and maybe, stretch it out for 5 years for them, or stretch it out for 10 years, even if they could live with that. And oftentimes, if we had someone who was a college student and they were getting some sum of money, we would try to get them to do a deal where they would take a structured settlement so that it paid them, say, $15,000 a year for 5 years while they were in college, or something like that. But I think that probably the simplest way you can try to use problem solving in your closure is just to simply brainstorm with the other side. Say, look, we're so close. What can we do? Let's think of some ideas that will pull us both together, get us both together, but that will still solve the problems that we both have. And try to just think about it, think it out, think out loud together. And more often than not, that you'll be surprised how often that'll work. Look, you're there negotiating, and if you're at the point where you're trying to close the deal, you've narrowed the gap already, so you're almost there. It's a really good time to be chummy and get everybody on the same page, because at that point everybody's invested a lot of time and energy, presumably, in getting you that close, and it just seems a waste not to come to a resolution. The last thing I would say is this. This is sort of I won't say a never, but this should almost never happen, and I'd be hard pressed to think of an example of when it should. Do not put your client at a disadvantage just to get the deal done. And it's very hard for me to imagine a circumstance where it's okay for your client to end up at a disadvantage just to get the deal done. That just goes against the grain. It probably goes against your ethical obligations, frankly, if you're an attorney. So it'd be hard pressed. I've never been able to think of a good example. I've tried and I've never come up with one. So don't do it, would be my advice. All right, that's enough on this section. So we're down to closing the deal. Like I said at the beginning, or maybe I didn't say at the beginning, but I'll tell you now, I'm thinking about compressing the next units 6 and 7 together, not because of timing, because we do have plenty of time, quite frankly, to get them done, mostly because I don't, in doing the planning, I think I probably stretched this out a little further than I needed to, looking at my notes and looking at what I know I need to cover. So that's probably what I'll do. I'll let you know that very, very soon. All right, there'll be a quiz for you to take on chapters 7, and 8, and I will be sending out very shortly, probably over the upcoming weekend. I'll send out an email with a negotiation for everybody to do via email like the last one.